we're going for today's Film School with Joe Fortunato. Film Study Professor Joe Fortunato joins us Fridays. He takes us to film school. So enough of the hint. Let's bring in our good friend Joe Fortunato. Joe, good morning, my friend. Take it from there.
Good morning, Ray. Good morning, everybody. And I think the hint pretty much gives it away, but a fun one today, I think. We are looking back, believe it or not, the 50th anniversary next month of Tommy from 1975, released March 19th, 1975, at least in the U.S. And this is, of course, The Who's Tommy, brought to the big screen by director Ken Russell, written by The Who, Ken Russell, and Pete Townsend. It stars, of course, Roger Daltrey, Ann-Margret, Oliver Reed, Robert Powell, and segments and cameos by a bunch of great rock luminaries, including Elton John, Eric Clapton, The Who themselves, Jack Nicholson, Tina Turner, and so on and so forth. And one of the things that, because when we were talking about doing this one, I thought, okay, this is a little different. It's a little bit of a cult movie, at least in my mind.
Yeah.
And I still sort of think that. But when I was kind of, reflecting back on this, it was actually a little bit more mainstream than I had remembered. Believe it or not, it had 2 Oscar nominations.
Wow.
One for Best Actress by Ann-Margret and for the music by Pete Townsend. And we usually don't talk Golden Globes on our segment here, but it also had 2 nominations for Golden Globes for Best Picture, Best Acting Debut by Roger Daltrey, and it won for Ann-Margret. She won a Golden Globe for Best Actress. So, it was kind of mainstream-ish, if you want to call it that. This is the only time in history where the Oscar-nominated actress in a lead or any category for that matter, which is entirely sung, except she has one word that's spoken, but the entire performance is sung. So that's a little bit interesting. And again, success was more mainstream than I had recalled. The film reached #1 on the U.S. box office charts in March of 1975, which is sort of interesting because The Who themselves had never had a #1 single or album on the U.S. charts. And here they are having a #1 movie. The first words, I mentioned that it's mostly just sung. The first words are actually sung lyrics, don't even occur until 7 minutes into the film, which is, again, a little unusual, a little more avant-garde. And speaking of some of those singers, according to Pete Townsend, now Oliver Reed had incredible problems recording his part of the soundtrack because he just couldn't sing. And kind of a requirement for the part, you might think. And he was able to complete it only because his singing parts were recorded in small bits. And because of this frustrating experience, Townsend was really suspicious about hiring or bringing on Jack Nicholson when he was chosen for a role of the Doctor. But Townsend agreed, and Nicholson kind of sang effortlessly, at least by Nicholson standards.
Yeah.
And all of the actors, including Jack Nicholson and Oliver Reed and Ann-Margret, they all perform their own songs. There's no dubbing here. All of the movie was recorded to a soundtrack, except for the Pinball Wizard sequence, which The Who really did play in front of a theater audience. It is Elton John's band that's on the soundtrack, but in terms of the performance there, the iconic Pinball Wizard segment was recorded live. And if you remember the film, and again, I think of this sort of as a little bit an unknown or forgotten gem, so maybe a lot of our listeners don't remember. But if you do, there's a very famous bean scene, for lack of a better thing, where Ann-Margret is kind of going crazy, and she's watching television, and there's these commercials, and one's for baked beans. So she gets swamped in a river of baked beans, if you can imagine that. And Ken Russell, the director, told her character, hey, you're having a nervous breakdown, do whatever you want. And she just kind of went crazy. But unfortunately, she stuck her hand in broken glass on the television screen, and they had to rush her to the hospital for stitches there. Elton John initially turned down the part of the Pinball Wizard, but the producer, Robert Stigwood, kind of held out to get John, and he finally agreed to play the role on one condition, that he could keep the oversized Doc Marten boots from his costume. And again, those who remember the film, they're very iconic, very campy, comically large boots. So that was his stipulation.
It was the most psychedelic movie I ever watched or ever took in. There may be more, but everything in regards to that movie was so psychedelic, strange. But Joe, to your point there, it's one that you really got to watch. And if you haven't watched it in years, go back and watch it again. I did, probably 3 or 4 years ago, because it had been decades since I saw it. I appreciated it more for, like you said, everybody doing their own music.
Yeah, and you know, there's we always like to talk about casting. This is kind of some fun stuff. The original choice to play the Acid Queen, which went to Tina Turner, was David Bowie. He was going to be the Acid Queen. And at one point when they were having problems casting the role, Tiny Tim was considered. There's a name from the past for the role of the Acid Queen. Peter Sellers was considered for the part of the Doctor that went to Jack Nicholson. And this one's kind of interesting, sort of funny, but I don't know if it's politically correct. But Townsend said that Stevie Wonder found out they were making a movie of Tommy, and he wanted to play the pinball wizard. But Townsend didn't think it would make sense that he would have a real blind guy playing a guy with sight playing pinball against someone who was supposed to be blind, deaf, and dumb, if you can follow that logic there. So Stevie Wonder wanted to play the pinball wizard himself. This is not casting, but another kind of interesting sort of thing. George Lucas was offered the chance to direct this movie, but turned it down because he was doing American Graffiti at the time. So, you know, some weird things. You know, you talked about seeing it yourself, and my personal memory of this is this is going to be make sense for local listeners. But back in the day when I was growing up, the movie theater in Highland Square in Akron used to show midnight movies, you know, every week, and they were, you know, usually rock themed. So they would show stuff like, you know, Yellow Submarine, or The Song Remains the Same, or you know, Quadrophenia, things like that. And that's where I first saw Tommy. And I was thinking about that at the time. It was only 10 years removed from when it was actually released as, you know, a mainstream movie in the theater. So kind of a fun memory for me. And I've always enjoyed The Who, really like this movie. So I'm kind of glad we took a stroll down memory lane on this one today.
Yeah, most certainly. If you haven't watched it in a while, I think it's a must-see. And if you've never watched it, go back and pull it up somewhere and give it a look. Today we go to film school with Tommy, with Joe Fortunato.
Yeah, I just want to interject a few things. I actually have quite a few things going on in the next month or so for our listeners. So the main one that I mentioned last week, and I want to mention again, is next Saturday morning, I will be doing a lecture on the history of the Oscars. So it's not only Oscar history. We're going to talk about some of the things that make the Academy work. We'll talk about, of course, this year's nominees, and have a discussion about it. It's going to be, as usual, fun and informative. And that is next Saturday, March 1st at 11 a.m. at the Green Branch Library in the city of Green. That is an absolutely free event. And I encourage everybody to come on down and learn a little bit about the Oscars in anticipation of the Oscar telecast on Sunday. And then I won't go into a bunch of stuff in the future, but I encourage everyone to go to my new website, joefortunato.net. That's joefortunato.net, and go to the events page, and we'll be talking about some of these things in the week to come. But I have a number of things, both for our local audience and for our audience streaming online from all parts.
We always like to say Joe knows Oscars, that's for sure. So make sure you take part in that next Saturday morning and visit his site. Thanks, Joe, my friend. Always enjoy it. We'll do it again next week.